Hi, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. This podcast of the People's Pharmacy is brought to you by Squatty Potty Toilet Stools. They create healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. Learn more about toilet posture and health at squattypotty.com. That's SQUATTYPOTTY.com.
Have you banished butter, cream, and other sources of saturated fat from your diet? Does that make you healthier? This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
For decades, public health officials have been haranguing Americans to clean up their diets and get rid of the fat. Walk through any supermarket and you'll see shelves full of low-fat and no-fat foods. So why are we getting fatter as a nation?
Obesity and diabetes have increased dramatically over the last few decades. Why hasn't our low-fat diet worked to prevent these problems?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, the author of The Big Fat Surprise will tell us why butter, meat, and cheese belong in a healthy diet.
First, this news.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, the Mediterranean diet has once again shown superiority over a low-fat diet in reversing cardiovascular risk. Spanish researchers analyzed data from the PREDIMED study in which volunteers were randomized to follow one of three diets. Some participants followed a Mediterranean-type diet that was supplemented with nuts. Others followed the same diet but got large portions of extra virgin olive oil instead of nuts. The third group followed a low-fat diet. They were followed for roughly 5 years. In this new analysis, the investigators were specifically studying a serious cardiovascular risk called metabolic syndrome. It's related to waist circumference and elevations in blood glucose, blood pressure, and triglycerides. The people assigned to the Mediterranean diets with extra nuts or extra olive oil were better able to reduce blood glucose and waist circumference than those on the low-fat diet. They also appeared more capable of overcoming metabolic syndrome. The low-fat diet craze of the 1990s appears to be losing credibility with high-quality research.
Add liver protection to the many benefits of coffee drinking. Researchers have been reporting for years that regular coffee consumption is associated with a lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes, as well as certain kinds of cancer. Now, scientists at the National Cancer Institute report that consumption of 3 cups of regular or decaffeinated coffee a day is linked to lower liver enzyme levels. That suggests that ingredients in coffee itself, rather than caffeine, could be responsible for the protective effect.
Researchers at Mass General Hospital for Children and Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine teamed up to investigate whether a component of broccoli sprouts could be beneficial for young men diagnosed with autism. The scientists administered either sulforaphane or a placebo to 40 subjects between 13 and 27 years old. Those who were randomly assigned to receive sulforaphane daily for 18 weeks showed significant improvements in social interaction and verbal communication skills. Their levels of repetitive ritualistic behaviors diminished. The hypothesis is that sulforaphane harnesses the body's heat shock response and reduces inflammation. It isn't possible to get the amounts of sulforaphane used in the study by eating broccoli or even broccoli sprouts, since the researchers used highly concentrated extracts in pill form.
Patients who develop Clostridium difficile infections are afflicted with debilitating diarrhea. When these bacteria take over the digestive tract after antibiotic treatment, they can be very difficult to eradicate. One strategy that's worked has a very high ick factor. That's because it involves fecal transplants. Stool from a healthy person is administered via a colonoscopy or through a nasogastric tube. Now, researchers at Massachusetts General Hospital have developed a less challenging technique. They've strained, centrifuged, and frozen healthy stool and put it inside capsules. Most people have little difficulty swallowing these pills, which can restore a healthier bacterial balance to the digestive tract. Of the 20 patients treated for C. diff, 19 experienced dramatic relief from diarrhea and other digestive woes.
Doctors, nurses, and other health professionals have been urged to wash their hands frequently. Hospitals even penalize healthcare professionals who don't follow hygiene guidelines. But is the message getting through to patients that hand washing is especially important inside hospitals? Canadian researchers used electronic monitoring technology on soap and sanitizer dispensers to measure when patients in 3 transplant units washed their hands. These people are especially prone to severe infections such as norovirus, C. diff, or methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus because their immune systems are suppressed. Nonetheless, these patients only wash their hands about 30% of the time after using the bathroom, 40% of the time before meals, and only 3% of the time when using cooking facilities on the units. Perhaps it's time for hospitals to focus attention on hand hygiene for patients and visitors, as well as healthcare providers. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. We're always told that a healthy diet is the foundation for good health. But what constitutes a healthy diet? There's so much conflicting information out there that most people wonder who and what to believe about what we should be eating.
For decades, we were told by nutrition experts that butter was bad, nuts would make us fat, and that eating meat and cheese would surely lead to heart attacks.
Ooh.
How good was the evidence that supported these dietary prohibitions? And are we thinner, healthier, and less likely to have cardiovascular catastrophes when we choose low-fat yogurt and skim milk?
To get the answers to these and related questions, we turn now to author Nina Teicholz. She's an investigative reporter who has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. She covered Latin America for National Public Radio. Her book is The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet.
Welcome to the People's Pharmacy, Nina Teicholz.
Hi, nice to be here.
Nina, you open your book with a story about the Inuit. Sometime around the turn of the 20th century, an anthropologist, Dr. Stephenson, observed their diets and found they ate vegetables only when they were desperate in famine conditions. Were his observations a surprise to everybody?
Well, yes. I mean, at the turn of the 20th century, there was not this anti-fat feeling that we have been living with now for the last 50 years. But they were certainly surprising because the Inuit in the Arctic, this was Dr. Stephenson, who was a anthropologist trained at Harvard, who went up to live with them for years and recorded their diets, found them amongst the healthiest people he had ever observed, and observed that they ate mainly caribou and salmon, altogether a diet of what he estimated was 70 to 80% fat. And as you said, vegetables, berries, only in very limited quantities. They had a very low carbohydrate diet, what he called famously carnivorous people. And he was not believed when he came back from the Arctic, and he wrote books about it. And at that time, there was this sort of in the 50s, there was the beginnings of an anti-fat sentiment, feelings that fat might be bad for you, might cause heart disease. And so Stephenson then did this extraordinary experiment where he and a colleague for an entire year checked themselves into Bellevue Hospital. Just for the first 2 weeks they were in the hospital, and then they spent the whole year eating nothing but meat and fat under the supervision of an expert medical team, at the end of which he discovered he had lost weight, and by every marker they could measure, he looked, and his colleague looked perfectly healthy. So that was this incredible experiment that has been sort of lost in the nutrition literature, but it was like an early point of science that now has been confirmed. But in those days, he really was barely believed.
Well, it sounds like an early experiment before the fact of the Atkins diet. But was the diet mostly lean meat or was it mostly fat?
It was mostly fat. He found that 2 parts fat to 1 part meat was the healthiest. And in fact, when his doctors tried to put him on leaner meat without, as he said, the portion of fat, that was the only time that he experienced nausea, dizziness. He didn't feel well at all. And he said, then I fried up some brains and ate those and felt better right away. So, and that's actually sort of a misconception about the Atkins diet. It's not a high protein diet. It's moderate in protein. It's a high fat diet. And we can talk later about the clinical trials that have recently been done, also high-fat diets, not necessarily high in protein.
Now, I want to go back to the Inuit because, we sort of imagine that they were living under very harsh conditions. I mean, very cold, oftentimes having difficulty finding, enough to eat. Were they really as healthy as Dr. Stefansson suggested?
Well, there have been other medical anthropologists and scientists, doctors who went and analyzed the diet of the Inuit. Of course, we don't have records about how long they lived. They didn't have much of a written culture at all. So, there's one doctor who looked at all the medical records in a hospital in the Arctic and discovered he couldn't find any trace of diabetes. There was just very little, no trace of cancer. So, to the best of our knowledge, there really was very little what we call chronic disease, the kind of disease that evolves over the course of a lifetime. But, just to put that study in perspective, that data point of the Inuit, along with many other data points that, there were people that were observed in Africa, there were Italian immigrants in the United States, all those data points, it's not meant to prove that diet was the healthiest, but simply to show those data points were contradictory to what American nutrition experts believed, which is that a low-fat diet was the healthiest. And our nutrition experts did not reckon with these data points. They were inconvenient bits of data about people living healthfully on a high-fat diet. And our nutrition experts have ignored all of those data points for decades now, and they continue to do so. So that's why I talk about the Inuit in my book, and I talk about other kinds of people who are observed on high-fats dying being healthy, just to show how much the nutrition establishment had to ignore to keep its hypothesis going over so many decades.
Well, we tend to think about rising cholesterol and rising blood pressure as a normal consequence of aging. And we think, especially for people who are eating saturated fat. So do people in these traditional groups, I should say, because I'm sure that at this point in the 21st century, those traditional diets are pretty much history. But did those folks also have higher cholesterol and blood pressure as they grew older?
There's another really interesting group that I write about. In Africa, there was a group of Maasai warriors that were observed by a University of Vanderbilt biochemist named George Mann. He went there in the 1970s and observed that they ate nothing but, the warrior class ate nothing but blood, meat, and milk solely as their diet, which, by all the conventional knowledge that we have should mean that they were having heart attacks and dying like flies. In fact, he took electrocardiograms on 400 of them and found almost no trace of heart disease at all. And it was a completely transformative experience for him because he also found that their blood pressure did not rise with age. They did not gain weight. All the things that we normally associate with aging did not happen to these Maasai warriors. And he studied them rigorously. He was a man of science. So that completely changed his mind about, what he had learned about fat being bad for you and everything that was going on back in the United States in terms of our embracing of the low-fat diet. He found these data points to the contrary. I think he's also really an interesting story, George Mann, because he was one of the more outspoken critics about the low-fat diet, about a diet low in saturated fat, and his career really suffered for it, which is also part of the story about how critics of that idea were basically silenced.
Nina, I'd like to go back to how the saturated fat heart disease hypothesis really got a foothold. And became not just a foundation of heart disease research, but kind of an article of faith that pretty much every health professional has signed on to for the last 40 years. Tell us a little bit about the rabbit cholesterol experiments, and then who was Ancel Keys?
Right. So the rabbit experiments, they were done in the early part of the 20th century, in the 1918, by a Russian scientist who found that feeding massive amounts of cholesterol to rabbits would clog their arteries. So that sort of fixed, and they found that it was cholesterol in the arteries that built up and formed plaques, and that made cholesterol like suspect number one. And then in the 1950s, there was a panic that was spreading across America because heart disease had come from almost out of nowhere in the early 1900s to be the number one killer in the nation. And President Eisenhower himself had a heart attack and was out of the Oval Office for 10 days in 1955. So there was this tremendous sense of urgency about trying to find the cause of heart disease. And there was this one scientist, Ancel Keys, a pathologist at the University of Minnesota, and he proposed that it was saturated fats that caused heart disease. Saturated fats had been shown to raise your total cholesterol, and the idea was that would clog your arteries and give you a heart attack. That was called the diet-heart hypothesis. Keys was a outsized personality, extremely charismatic, unusually persuasive. And he managed to get that idea implanted into the American Heart Association, the world's first anti-saturated fat dietary guidelines for fighting heart disease were published by the American Heart Association in 1961. And that was like the acorn that grew into the giant oak tree of our dietary advice for the next 50 years. But at the time the American Heart Association issued that recommendation, there was really almost no evidence to support it. There was just one study that Ancel Keys himself had done called the 7-country study, which had numerous problems with it, the main one being that it could only show association and not causation. But the sense of public health urgency meant that everybody, scientists, experts, felt that weak science had to be made to suffice in order to move forward on the fight against heart disease.
You're listening to author Nina Teicholz. She's an investigative reporter who has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. She's written about food and nutrition policy for Gourmet magazine and for Men's Health. She covered Latin America for National Public Radio. Her book is The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet.
It's so fascinating that the diet-heart hypothesis was born with such little evidence.
Right. All those rabbits eating something they don't normally eat.
Cholesterol. They
Right.
usually like grass. After the break, we'll learn about the famous 7-country study. What was it, and what were its strengths and weaknesses?
After so many decades, why is Ancel Keys' 7-country study still the basis of our dietary recommendations?
There was early evidence against saturated fat. What was it? And when we look at low-carb versus low-fat diets, we discover some unexpected consequences.
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon. Thanks for listening to this podcast of The People's Pharmacy. If you like it, why not rate or review it in the iTunes store? We'd appreciate it. Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is made possible in part by Red X Industries, makers of utterly smooth creams and lotions that deeply moisturize to make dry skin feel soft and smooth. The number's 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
And by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
If you would like to order a CD of this show, you can call 800-732-2334. This is show number 966. That number again, 800-732-2334, online at peoplespharmacy.com.
Today on the People's Pharmacy, we're exploring the science behind the dietary dogma of the last few decades. How did saturated fat become the enemy? Why did eggs, butter, whole milk, and cheese get banished from the kitchen table? When we focus on low-fat eating, are there unexpected consequences?
Our guest is Nina Teicholz, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet.
Nina, you've just been talking about a study that actually is pretty famous, the 7-country study conducted by Ancel Keys, on which he based the diet heart hypothesis that he came up with and kind of dominated nutrition science, more or less, for most of the 20th century. What did he do in the 7-country study? What did it show?
The 7-country study was like the big bang of nutrition studies. Its importance is really outsized, and it was the first major study to be done to show that there was some kind of link between diet and disease. Ancel Keys sampled nearly 13,000 middle-aged men in 7 countries, mainly in Europe and also the U.S. and Japan. And he found what he had hoped to find because he went into the study with already his hypothesis formed that people who limited their saturated fat consumption had a lower risk of dying from a heart attack. But there were numerous methodological problems with that study that have, since it's been examined many years later and analyzed, and, I've really gone back into a lot of that original research to see, well, what actually did it say? So it turns out one of the problems was that in selecting his countries for the study, he chose countries that he knew would support his hypothesis. So he chose Greece and Italy, for instance, where he knew they ate very little saturated fat, mainly because they were suffering from post-World War II devastation, but they didn't have a lot of animal foods and they had very low rates of heart disease. But he avoided countries like France, West Germany, Switzerland, which would have disproved his hypothesis, places where they ate a lot of saturated fat, but didn't have much heart disease. So, in other words, he sort of cherry-picked his countries to get the result that he wanted. I also found that he went, for example, his star subjects were on the island of Crete, peasants who tilled the land and were very long-lived. It turns out that he had 3 dietary surveys there, one of which occurred during Lent, when they were conscientiously, for religious reasons, avoiding meat, cheese, butter, dairy, eggs. So he undercounted saturated fat in that population. And altogether, he studied only a tiny, statistically insignificant group of men, under 500, out of this huge sample of 13,000. So, and I should say another thing, it's an epidemiological study which shows association but cannot be used to show causation, which only a clinical trial can do. So there were just many problems with that study, but because it was the biggest study ever done to date in the 1950s, and he was this charismatic personality, that study, which has now been cited, over 1 million times, became it was the foundational work upon which all of our dietary recommendations have been based for the last half century.
Well, Nina, you mentioned his dietary evidence that he collected in Crete, but you said in the book, you point out that he also collected some dietary evidence in Corfu, which is right next door to Crete, more or less. It didn't support his hypothesis. So what did he do with it?
There are many data points like that which didn't work out for him, and he just ignored that data, or he selectively interpreted his data is a better way to put that. I mean, it's a phenomenon that has occurred over and over again amongst nutrition experts because they started off with this hypothesis. There's so much data that did not support it, and again they have what's called selection bias. They chose the data points that supported it, and they tended to ignore data that did not support it. I mean, I'll just tell you about the most famous extraordinary ever example of this kind of selection bias was a study called the Minnesota Coronary Heart Project that involved thousands of men who were in a mental hospital. So they were completely controlled as a population. They were studied for, I think, 7 years. And at the end, it was shown that the men on the high saturated fat diet were no more likely to die of heart disease than men who had been given a diet high in vegetable oils to replace those saturated fats. And that study, the lead investigator, who was deeply invested in it was a colleague of Ansel Keys and was part of, very much part of the nutrition establishment, he did not publish his study for more than a decade. And when he was asked why he did not publish that study, he said, well, the results just really were so disappointing when they came out.
Oh, my goodness. Well, tell us a little bit more about early evidence over the last couple of decades that did not support the diet heart hypothesis, like the one you've just mentioned, and how, for the most part, it's been ignored by the nutrition establishment.
There were so many examples of that. I mean, we talked about the Inuit, we talked about the Maasai, there was the Minnesota Coronary Heart Project, there was a group of Italians who lived in a place called Roseto, Pennsylvania, who were observed eating prosciutto with an inch of lard, fat around the edge, and cooking all their food in lard. Yet over the course of several years, there were no heart attacks observed amongst any of their men. That was a study that was published in one of the most prominent nutrition journals in the late 70s. And that study was pounced on by Ansel Keys and his colleagues who made every attempt to kind of basically rip it to shreds. There's an extraordinary amount of viciousness in the field of nutrition studies that I discovered. I mean, just name-calling and almost outright slander of the nutrition researchers who were trying to do studies that didn't conveniently support this diet heart hypothesis. There was also a study done in India on 1 million railroad workers by a researcher named Malhotra, and he found in the 1970s again that the people in the north of India were eating 9 to 14 times more fat than people in the south, yet died, I think it's 12 years. They lived 12 years longer, the people on the high-fat diet. It was mainly dairy fat that they were eating. And Malhotra concluded that maybe his recommendation would be for people to eat more dairy, full-fat dairy. Another study published in a very prominent medical journal and also ignored. I mean, there's such a long list of studies like that. It's almost extraordinary that they were able to be dismissed and not admitted to the evidence base.
Well, Nina, how did the weak evidence that was available then become the foundation of our national dietary policy?
It is such a complex story. It really involves the politicization of science, the bias that I talk about, the certain amount of influence from industry, food companies, the institutions, the National Institute of Health, the American Heart Association, the USDA. They became institutionally invested in this hypothesis. I mean, I think there are many actors in this complex, textured story, but I think fundamentally when I came down to trying to point the finger, if there were one actor or there was one place in which I could lay blame, it was really a failure of science, of scientists responding to urgent public health problems and forcing weak science to make do. They truly believed what their conclusions. They believed that fat and saturated fat caused heart disease and that they probably caused obesity, maybe cancer. But weak science again and again was just pressed into service. And critics who urged that more trials were needed, more science needed to be done, they were seen as kind of weak and lacking in the kind of boldness that was needed to solve these urgent public health issues. So it was really a failure of science, I think, in the end.
Well, I find it fascinating that even today, when a study comes out, as it did not too long ago in the Annals of Internal Medicine, a highly respected journal, this research funded by the National Institutes of Health, in which a group of people, older people, multiracial people, male as well as women, and they were randomized either to low fat or to low carb. And the people on the low-carb diet did better. They lost more weight, and they had a better cardiovascular risk profile. And yet again, mainstream medicine seems to have a really hard time with it. So despite the changing evidence, there is still tremendous resistance.
Well, I think what we're seeing now is that we're really in the third generation of a monolithic universe of scientists believing that fat, and especially saturated fat, cause heart disease, obesity, maybe cancer, diabetes. So there really is nobody thinking outside of that paradigm anymore. So you have, there has actually been over the last decade, a growing number of scientists who've been experimenting with exactly the opposite, which is a diet high in fat and low in carbohydrates. This study that you're talking about, the one in the Annals of Internal Medicine that just came out, that's just the latest in a stream of dozens of clinical trials that have come out, actually, and have shown the same thing, that a high-fat diet restricted in carbohydrates looks better for weight loss, for fighting heart disease and diabetes. And an analysis that was recently done of all those clinical trials shows that you are 100% more likely to lose weight on a high-fat diet than you are on a low-fat diet. But all of these studies, as they've come out, again, there's a kind of a desire by the nutrition experts, really at the very top, at our expert panels at the USDA and the American Heart Association, which are most responsible for our dietary policy today. They do not reckon with those studies. The researchers who perform them say their results are met with silence. There's no discussion of them. They're not talked about on expert panels. They were not reckoned with in the last set of the dietary guidelines in 2010. The studies are barely mentioned. But there's a huge growing body of literature that supports this idea that the low-fat diet does not work nearly as well as a diet that is high in fat. I think that situation might finally now be changing because there's such a quantity of evidence now out there. And it just, the drumbeat of these studies coming out has increased in frequency, and there are more scientists who are reckoning with them, and they're higher level scientists, and the kind of freeze on discussion that has existed for decades in the world of nutrition about the potential efficacy of a high-fat diet is, I think, finally now thawing. But it has been a very, very long time.
Are people starting to vote with their feet and their fingers and their pocketbooks? I mean, there was that cover of Time magazine, very striking, where it said, "Eat butter," and there's this big piece of butter right on the cover, and under it says, "Scientists labeled fat the enemy, why they were wrong." And yet, if you go into the supermarket, you still see gobs of low-fat yogurt and 2% and low-fat cottage cheese, and you just know that it doesn't taste nearly as good as the full-fat stuff.
Well, so yes, that Time magazine story, which was taken right from my book, I think that's a signal of some change that is happening. There's obviously the low-fat mantra of decades now is going to take a long time to change. And we are probably going to, the next decade, we'll see these two paradigms exist side by side. The low-fat dogma is going to continue, but increasingly, I think we'll see more and more of this low-carb idea. LeBron James has gone low-carb. And there's more and more science behind it. But I think there's a difference in nutrition science and why we might see change faster, which is that everybody has their own observation of their own body. So, whereas we might have gotten the science on, say, air pollution wrong, none of us can test that ourselves. We're unable to create our own science. But in nutrition, we all have our own experience with our own bodies. Everybody's doing their own scientific experiment of, with one observation themselves. So it's possible, and this is already what's happening out there. There's a huge burgeoning low-carb paleosphere, I call it, out in the internet. There's websites and magazines and books and they exist kind of in this subterranean world. They're really not recognized by mainstream medical or nutrition experts. But these are people who are experimenting on their own bodies and seeing extraordinary results. And so people are voting with their own bodies about what kind of diet they want.
Voting with their own forks. Tell us, Nina, please, has the low-fat dietary recommendations that have held sway for so long had unintended consequences?
Well, when you take fat, especially saturated fat, off your plate, you remove meat, cheese, butter, dairy, eggs. What replaces that? I mean, those used to be the centerpieces of meals for millennia. What has replaced them, and what we've been told to replace them with, is that big bottom slab of the USDA food pyramid: pasta, grains. We've been told to eat 60% of our calories as carbohydrates. And we have done that. In the last 30 years, we've increased our carbohydrate consumption by 25%. The problem with carbohydrates is they are converted into glucose in our bloodstream, and glucose triggers your pancreas to release insulin. Insulin is like the king of all hormones for making you fat. And moreover, the glucose is often paired with fructose. Sugar is about half glucose, half fructose, as is high fructose corn syrup. And together they seem to work together, raise triglycerides, worsen some of your other cholesterol markers. Fructose has also been implicated in fatty liver disease. So the increase in grains, pasta, carbohydrates altogether seems to have led to the conditions for the obesity and diabetes crisis that we're seeing today. Because just going back on the diabetes question, if you are exposed chronically to insulin over days and months, that leads to insulin, an intolerance for insulin, and that's eventually what leads to diabetes. So that is one big unintended consequence of shifting our calories from fat to carbohydrates. That was unforeseen when we all set out on this experiment. It was unforeseen by the experts who proposed it and when the U.S. government adopted it in 1978. So that was one of the unintended consequences of shifting our calories from fat to carbohydrates.
You're listening to Nina Teicholz, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet. She's an investigative reporter who has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker.
And so many of the guests on the People's Pharmacy are now pointing a finger to sugar, and in particular fructose, as Nina has just mentioned, as well as all those carbohydrates.
Well, I don't know if you remember the French paradox, but perhaps the explanation of the French paradox is that the original paradigm was just mistaken.
Coming up, we'll find out more about saturated fat and what replaced it.
When did we start using vegetable oils? Are they as helpful and healthful as they were expected to be?
We'll find out about cholesterol and triglycerides and how fat in our diets affects these blood lipids.
We've heard a lot about the Mediterranean diet and its benefits. How does it compare to a low-fat diet? What about an Atkins-style diet?
Find out what kinds of fat science tells us we should be eating. Why are dietary recommendations so emotionally charged?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
If you value the health information you get when you listen to The People's Pharmacy, consider subscribing to our email newsletter. You'll get the latest health news and information on upcoming podcasts delivered to your inbox twice a week. Look for the link at peoplespharmacy.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Squatty Potty Toilet Step Stools, creating healthy toilet posture for fast, easy elimination. More information about how toilet posture affects your health at squattypotty.com.
And by Redix Industries, makers of utterly smooth foot cream with shea butter, helping dry, cracked feet feel soft and smooth. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you'd like to order a CD of today's show or any People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 966. That number again is 800-732-2334, or you can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com.
We're talking about food. The American Heart Association, as well as many governmental agencies, have promoted a low-fat, high-carb eating plan for decades. What are the consequences of following such recommendations? We're talking with Nina Teicholz, author of the New York Times bestseller, The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet.
Nina, just before the break, we were talking about switching from a traditional high-fat diet to a low-fat diet. Making an effort to reduce saturated fat consumption must have had an impact on the American diet. Can you tell us more about that, please?
Well, when we decided to remove saturated fats from our diet, starting in 1961 with the American Heart Association, what replaced them? We were told to eat unsaturated fats instead. That means vegetable oils, basically, sunflower, safflower, peanut, corn, today mainly soybean oil. And before 1900, Americans cooked almost entirely with butter and lard exclusively. And vegetable oils were introduced into our food supply really in 1911 in the form of Crisco, was the first vegetable oil that was made of safflower oil that had been hardened. And then we've come to ramp up our vegetable oil consumption to the point where they comprise 7 to 8% of all the calories that we consume today. So these vegetable oils are really they're really kind of untested in many ways. In the early experiments, when they gave people large amounts of vegetable oil to replace saturated fat, experiments done in the 1970s, they found that there were some very worrisome side effects, such as greatly increased rates of cancer and gallstones that were never adequately explained. Also, greater rates of death from violent deaths and accidents and suicides, which is a category, and it's later been found that cholesterol depletion in the brain and fatty acid imbalance in the brain causes psychological problems and depression. So, and there was actually enough concern about these results that had been found again and again in a number of large clinical trials that the National Institute of Health in the early 1980s had a series of expert meetings and convened scientists to try to figure out what was going on. But they really They couldn't figure it out. And they basically said, well, it's still so important to reduce saturated fat that, whatever these consequences are secondary to that. So we have greatly increased the amount of vegetable oils that are in our diet. And I think we do not fully understand what the impact of those has been.
You mentioned cholesterol. And for, again, the last 30 or 40 years, besides saturated fat, which was sort of enemy number one, cholesterol was a close second. And in fact, along came the statins, 2 or 3 decades ago, and they were extraordinarily good at getting LDL cholesterol under control. And I remember being out with a friend who basically had croissant and had a bunch of brie and was ready to finish everything off with a big bowl of ice cream. And I said, wow, that looks a little scary. He said, no problem. I'm on a statin. My numbers are going to be great. My doctor will never know. And so statins became sort of the drugs of choice to reduce the risk of heart disease. So I'm kind of curious, the whole LDL cholesterol, saturated fat connection, where do statins fit in? And then what about this other thing called triglycerides and its relationship to our carbohydrate cravings?
Okay, that's a lot of questions. But, just to statins work, but they have been shown to work not by lowering LDL cholesterol. In other words, statins are able to prevent heart attacks unrelated to whether or not they lower LDL cholesterol. They're thought to work by some other mechanism, which scientists don't really understand. They're called the pleiotropic effects. It may have to do with reducing inflammation. It may be something else. But saturated fats were condemned by Ansel Keys on their basis of raising total cholesterol. This is back in the 1950s when there was really a very primitive understanding of what's called biomarkers for heart attack risk. That's something you can measure, in you and I when you go to your doctor's office now to see what the risk of a heart attack might be down the line, right? So it's also called a risk factor. But our understanding of these biomarkers has evolved tremendously over the past 50 years. We now understand that there are much better predictors of heart attack risk than total cholesterol, which is shown to be relatively ineffective in predicting heart attack risk. And even LDL cholesterol has been shown in numerous large clinical trials to be relatively unable to predict heart attack risk. it turns out that what predicts that risk far better are some up-to-date biomarkers called, one is like your LDL particle number, another is your LDL cholesterol subfraction having to do with the density of your LDL cholesterol. These do a much better job of predicting risk, and by these more up-to-date risk factors, biomarkers, fat in the diet, including saturated fat, looks, if not fine, actually absolutely beneficial. So they improve by restricting carbohydrates and increasing fat. So in other words, saturated fat was convicted on the base of this very primitive evidence, total cholesterol, which has now crumbled away as a piece of evidence against it.
And triglycerides?
And triglycerides. So a diet high in carbohydrates and low in fat, such as the one that we've been recommended, does not do much to improve your triglycerides, which are markers of the fatty acids in your bloodstream. Triglycerides are a marker of, they combined with your HDL and they're a marker of what's called metabolic syndrome, which is a pretty good predictor of your risk for both diabetes and heart disease, and clusters also with obesity. And restricting carbohydrates turns out to be the best way to lower your triglycerides.
So it would suggest that substituting extra carbohydrates by cutting back on fat might not be so wonderful.
Well, that has been our experience. The whole American population, that has been the big experiment that we have undertaken for the last 30 years. We have decreased our saturated fat by 11%. We've ramped up our carbohydrates by 25%. We've increased our fruits and vegetables by 17%. And yet we look so much sicker and more obese. And diabetes is just a terrible epidemic now. And we haven't conquered heart disease. So, you just look at those data points and you have to conclude that there's something about our working hypothesis, about our recommended diet that we have been following that is not working.
Well, let's talk about a different recommendation for diet. Let's talk about the Mediterranean diet. And at this point, there are some studies, some, randomized controlled trials of the Mediterranean diet, but a lot of the recommendations have been based, again, on epidemiology. Can you tell us why the big fat surprise is not super enthusiastic about the Mediterranean diet?
Well, the Mediterranean diet, as a nutritional concept, was proposed by researchers in the early 1990s, and it was derived from data. Actually, some of it went back to Ansel Keys' study on the island of Crete, and it has been a good diet in the sense that it was welcomed by Americans. It sort of arrived as a savior because at that point, Americans had been living through the height of the non-fat 1980s, and the Mediterranean diet, it offered an acceptable fat, right? So olive oil, as Walter Willett, who's an epidemiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health, who's been a main force behind the Mediterranean diet, he said, the Mediterranean diet is like the USDA food pyramid with olive oil poured all over it. And that was great news to Americans. We'd been spraying our saute pans with Pam and trying to avoid fat in every form. This was before we were allowed good fats even, which we now have today, which has sort of broken that up a little bit. But the Mediterranean diet arrived as it was very welcome. But it turns out that the Mediterranean diet really, it's shown to be healthier, but it's really only been compared to the low-fat diet. I mean, the low-fat diet is a failed diet. It has been studied more than any other diet in the history of nutrition science. And it's been studied on tens of thousands of people, and it has been unable to show any benefit. The largest ever trial ever performed was the Women's Health Initiative on nearly 50,000 women. At the end of that study for 10 years, it was found that women who had been on that diet lost, on average, 1 pound, and they saw almost no benefits in terms of heart disease, cancer, and diabetes. So the low-fat diet is a failed diet. The Mediterranean diet looks better than that, but the Mediterranean diet has also been compared to a high-fat, low-carbohydrate Atkins-like diet. And that diet, the Atkins one, looks better than the Mediterranean diet. So, what I suggest is that The Mediterranean diet has been studied a lot, mainly because researchers love to travel around the Mediterranean. The olive oil industry funded a series of unbelievable, fantastic, best ever food conferences in Greece, Italy, Tunisia, Spain. People flock to them. Researchers, government officials, chefs, food writers flock to these conferences. And that's why we have such a big science on the Mediterranean diet. But it's perfectly possible that any higher fat traditional diet, maybe the Swedish diet, the Chilean diet, the German diet, higher in fat than the low fat failed diet, those diets might also look better. And also, of all the science that's been done on olive oil, that oil seems to be more stable and less likely to go rancid than vegetable oils like safflower, sunflower, soybean oil. So olive oil looks better than them, but scientists have not been able to show any special heart disease fighting powers for olive oil.
So, Nina, what are we to make of all of this? Because our listeners are getting really confused. They're saying, well, I've been following this low-fat diet for years, shopping for low-fat foods. Now you're telling me that may have been counterproductive. Then I got excited about the Mediterranean diet. Now you're saying it may not be the salvation that I thought it was. So what should I be eating for good health? What are you eating, and what are you recommending to friends and family?
Well, I think it's really important to point out that the diet that a lean, healthy person can eat is different than the kind of diet that people who are suffering from chronic disease, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, those people, basically those diseases are markers of intolerance of carbohydrates. And the best diet for those people is a diet that is really restricted in carbohydrates and high in fat and moderate in protein. I mean, that's really what the clinical trial evidence has shown us from the last decade. It's different what somebody who is constitutionally lean is able to eat. I mean, I myself have, due to the science that I have read and absorbed, and I'm basically a lean person, but so I could probably eat a wider range of things. I could probably eat bread if I wanted to, or sugar, but I think that those I really believe the science showing that people are healthier when they restrict those foods. So, for breakfast, I have bacon, eggs, sausage. I have whole fat yogurt mixed with coconut butter, which is really quite delicious. Lunch, I have chicken salad, egg salad, tuna salad. I have cheese and nuts as snacks. I have a lot of creamy cheeses that are delicious. I mean, one of the things about these foods is that they fill you up. The fat and protein really are naturally filling. When scientists have done overfeeding experiments, they find that it's almost impossible for people to overeat on meat. They would put stacks of pork chops in front of prisoners and say, "Eat these," and the prisoners would say, "We cannot." Whereas it's much more easy to overeat on carbohydrates, cookies, crackers, popcorn. And for dinner, I'm not afraid of meat. I don't think it's going to make me fat. I don't think it's going to give me heart disease. Red meat turns out to be much more nutritionally dense, have many more nutrients than chicken. It has folate, selenium, iron, zinc. You can't find those in any quantities really in chicken. I have green vegetables. And I really don't think about calories. I don't think about, I'm never hungry. One of the, the low-fat diet does work for people for a certain period of time, but it only works if you really restrict calories and therefore you're hungry, which is one of the things people don't talk about on that diet. The high-fat diet is one that you can eat unrestrictedly, and so you just don't have to worry about, counting calories or being hungry, which is a huge liberating experience if you've been a dieter for most of your life. As I started this off, I was a vegetarian. I was constantly thinking about what I could eat next. So, my diet has changed a lot over the last 10 years. As for recommending things to my friends and colleagues, I try not to lecture them too much. So, I think that I'm pretty much the only one of my women friends who will order a steak for lunch, and everybody else is eating salads. But, I'm the only one who's not hungry at the end of the meal.
Nina, why is this whole nutrition diet thing so emotional and people get so excited about it? I mean, we are going to be inundated by messages from a lot of folks who say, how could you put her on the radio? She is a nutcase. But, that's what happens. People get very, very excited when we talk about low fat or low carbs.
It's such an important issue for people. You eat, 3 times a day. You feed your children. You want to feel as if you're doing your best by them. You make decisions every day about food. And so it's a deeply important issue for people. Food is also wrapped up in our cultural traditions and are part of our sense of identity. I think food now also has an ethical dimension to it that we talk increasingly about because of the burden on the environment and the ethical difficulty that people think about when talking about eating animals. What I say in my book is, I think these are all extremely important, valid concerns, especially the ethical and environmental ones. And what I say is just that, I spent 9 years trying to get to the bottom of the problem, the question of what can we eat to be healthy? There's thousands of studies to read about that, and it's been such an issue of such contention. So let's just answer that question first. What can we eat to be healthier? And then we can figure out how to make that food sustainable and ethically viable for us.
Nina Teicholz, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've been listening to author Nina Teicholz. She's an investigative reporter who's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the New Yorker. She covered Latin America for National Public Radio. Her book is The Big Fat Surprise: Why Butter, Meat, and Cheese Belong in a Healthy Diet.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wadarsky engineers the program. Dave Graydon edits our interviews.
The People's Pharmacy is produced at the studios of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC.
The People's Pharmacy theme music is by B.J. Liederman.
The People's Pharmacy is made possible by Redix Industries, makers of Utterly Smooth Extra Care 20 Cream with 20% urea for extra skin protection. 800-345-7339, online at uttercream.com.
If you would like to order a CD of today's show or any other People's Pharmacy broadcast, you can call 800-732-2334. Today's show is number 966. That number again is 800-732-2334. Or you can find it at our website, peoplespharmacy.com.
When you visit our site, check out prescription drugs, herbal medicines, and home remedies. You can share your own experience and thoughts on today's show.
Sign up for our free online newsletter or the free podcast of the show. You need never miss another People's Pharmacy program again. You can also share it with a friend. It's all there at peoplespharmacy.com.
In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening, and please join us again next week.
We hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, please consider taking a minute to write a review on iTunes. And thanks for listening to The People's Pharmacy.
This is an ad by BetterHelp. BetterHelp recently surveyed over 16,000 people and found that while 75% of people believe it's wise to seek support, only 27% of Americans are in therapy, and people stay silent to avoid being judged. BetterHelp has over 10 years of experience matching you with the right therapist. Because we're all better with help. Visit BetterHelp.com/StopTheStigma for their first ever State of Stigma report, the latest in mental health research.